If you want to understand how absolute power really feels, do not imagine a king on a throne. Imagine the sound of a door closing behind you. Not a metaphor, not a symbol. A real wooden door, banded with iron, shutting you inside the Tower of London in the year 1536, when the fortress was no longer just a castle or a palace, but the most feared political holding chamber in England. And here is the part most people get wrong. The tower was not terrifying because it was always a medieval dungeon. It was more dangerous than that. It was organized uncertainty. A machine for breaking confidence. A place where rank could buy you cushions, servants, even decent food, but could not buy back the one asset that mattered most: your future. Stay with this story to the end, because the real secret of prison life in the tower is not what people think. It is not only the cold stone, the guards, the walls, or even the executions. It is the fact that in Henry VIII's England, the tower functioned like a balance sheet of fear. Once your name entered it, every relationship around you was repriced. Friends became liabilities. Silence became evidence. Faith became treason. Marriage became a political instrument. And the same crown that could make a queen could also decide that she had become a bad investment. That is the world you are entering now. Picture London before sunrise. The river moves black and slow under the morning mist. Barges cut across the Thames, carrying grain, timber, gossip, and prisoners. Ahead of you rises the tower, already ancient by Tudor standards, built after the Norman conquest to dominate the city, and later transformed into something even more psychologically useful: a fortress of state authority. By the Tudor period, it had become the realm's foremost state prison, a place designed to be seen as inescapable, whether or not every cell was physically unbearable. Its real power was reputational. Everyone in England knew what it meant to be sent there, and often the journey itself was part of the punishment. Important prisoners were frequently brought by water past the city that had known their names in freedom, toward the royal water entrance that later generations would call Traitor's Gate. That gate had originally been designed as a privileged river entrance to the medieval royal apartments. That transformation matters. A doorway meant for high status became, in the popular imagination, a threshold of disgrace. The architecture of monarchy had learned how to recycle prestige into terror. And in 1536, that meaning was especially sharp, because Henry VIII's government had changed the rules of reality. Only 2 years earlier, the Act of Supremacy had declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. The break with Rome was no longer a private dynastic quarrel. It was a constitutional revolution. A man who had once needed spiritual approval now made spiritual obedience a test of political loyalty. And once belief itself became measurable by the state, the tower became one of the places where that new order was enforced. So if you arrived here in 1536, you are not just entering a prison, you are entering the operating center of a new regime. The same government that had brought Thomas More to the tower and then to the scaffold in 1535 was now moving against Anne Boleyn in 1536. At the same moment, the crown was beginning the first wave of the dissolution of the monasteries, transferring religious wealth and institutional power into royal hands. In other words, the tower stood at the intersection of theology, money, and force. It was where fear became administration. Now imagine your first hour inside. If you were a high-status prisoner, you were not necessarily thrown into a hole in the ground. That image survives because it is dramatic, but the truth is more revealing. Conditions at the tower varied wildly according to rank, money, and political usefulness. Some prisoners lived in gloomy confinement, others had private chambers, bedding, servants, books, visits, and room enough to pace. The tower was not a single prison experience. It was a hierarchy in stone. The crown did not merely confine bodies there. It staged status there. That hierarchy made every ordinary object feel political. A chair, a blanket, a fire, a servant, a window with some light, permission to walk, permission to write, permission to see a confessor or receive news from outside. None of these things were merely comforts. They were signals. They told you where you stood in relation to power, and more importantly, how far power might still be willing to go on your behalf. In a place like the Tower, conditions were not only about living standards, they were a language. That is why Anne Boleyn's arrival in May 1536 was so psychologically perfect and so cruel. When she asked whether she would be taken to a dungeon, the response, recorded by the Tower's constable, was no. She would be lodged in the very apartments where she had stayed before her coronation, only 3 years earlier. Think about that. The same rooms that had once signalled ascent now became a chamber of collapse. That is not just imprisonment. That is narrative violence. Henry's state was not only removing her freedom, it was forcing her to sit inside the ruins of her own success. And that was the real daily punishment for many elite prisoners in the Tower. Not pain at every moment, but waiting. Waiting under surveillance. Waiting for a council decision. Waiting for a confession to be extracted, a witness to turn, an indictment to be drafted, or a royal mood to harden. The hours were not empty. They were weaponized. Every footstep in the corridor could be routine or final. Every visit could mean mercy, interrogation, spiritual pressure, or the last administrative step before death. If you were there in 1536, you also understood something else with brutal clarity. The law no longer felt like a shield. It felt like choreography. Charges of treason, adultery, heresy, or disloyal speech did not move through the system with modern ideas of neutral process. They moved through a court culture built around proximity to the king, factional rivalry, and political necessity. The Tower was where that necessity acquired physical form. Not because every prisoner was innocent, but because innocence had become a weak currency in a court where usefulness mattered more than consistency. Listen closely, and you can feel the rhythm of a day there. Morning prayers, guard rotations, quiet conversations cut short when officers approach, food arriving as routine, not comfort. The muffled life of the garrison and household continuing around you, because the Tower was never only a prison. It remained a living fortress, an administrative complex, a royal arsenal, a symbol under constant use. That may be the most unsettling detail of all. Your private terror existed inside somebody else's normal workday, and the walls themselves became part of that rhythm. Later Tudor prisoners left carvings, names, emblems, and devotional marks in places like the Beauchamp and Salt Towers, evidence that confinement created an almost unbearable need to leave proof of self behind. In a world where the crown could erase reputation with a warrant, scratching your name into stone became a form of resistance. You might lose office, land, liberty, and eventually life. But perhaps the wall would remember that you had been there, and that you had not vanished silently. And then there was the psychological arithmetic of reputation. Outside the Tower, your household was already shrinking in confidence. Servants were listening more carefully. Associates were calculating distance. Credit, influence, and protection all began to evaporate the moment suspicion hardened into imprisonment. In a financial sense, confinement in the Tower was reputational insolvency. People who had traded on your favor yesterday were now asking whether survival required denying they ever stood too near you. Prison life did not stop at the walls. It spread through networks. Anne Boleyn's fall made that mechanism visible to the entire kingdom. She had once been the political centre of Henry's revolution, the woman for whom he had broken with Rome, rearranged the succession, and defied Europe's most powerful interests. Yet on May 2nd, 1536, she was arrested and sent to the Tower on charges including adultery and incest, charges many historians regard as fabricated or politically driven. Once the process began, the outcome looked less like a search for truth than a controlled demolition. A sham trial filled with enemies convicted her, and the spectacle of law gave the king's will an official costume. This is why the Tower mattered so much to Tudor power. Executions were only the visible tip of the structure. The deeper purpose was signalling. The Tower told the political nation that no rank was safe, no intimacy with the king permanent, no past service sufficient collateral against present suspicion. It converted monarchy into a market of radical instability, where the price of miscalculation could be your head. And yet, for all its fearsome reputation, we should be precise. Torture at the Tower did occur, especially in the Tudor and Stuart periods, but it was not the daily experience of every prisoner, and was used relatively selectively, mainly to extract information in high-stakes cases. In 1536, for a figure like Anne Boleyn, the more efficient tools were isolation, controlled access, legal theatre, and certainty that the king's ministers were already building the end of the story. The Tower did not need to brutalize everyone physically. Its symbolic power often did the work first. Then comes the final act, and this is where the mythology hardens into steel. On May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed on Tower Green, inside the fortress, rather than at the larger public execution site on Tower Hill. That privacy was not kindness in the modern sense. It was status management. High-born deaths inside the Tower were more controlled, more contained, and more politically curated. Henry even granted her what contemporaries treated as a small mercy: a skilled French swordsman, rather than an axeman. The execution of a queen for treason was unprecedented in England, and the Crown staged it carefully because the state understood theatre as well as violence. Now step back and look at the year as a whole. 1536 was not simply the year Anne died. It was the year Henry's regime deepened its claim over conscience, property, and loyalty. The smaller monasteries began to fall. Their lands, revenues, and movable wealth were drawn toward the crown. The old religious order was being dismantled, while the Tower continued to absorb the human consequences of resistance, hesitation, or political failure. That is why prison life in the Tower cannot be understood as a Gothic side story. It was part of a larger state project: centralize authority, confiscate competing power, and make resistance emotionally expensive. If this story is changing the way you see history, subscribe now and share this video with one person who is truly close to you, someone with whom you want to build a better relationship for the sake of your children and the stories they will inherit from you. Because the best family inheritance is not just money. It is judgment. It is teaching the next generation how power behaves, how institutions manipulate fear, and how quickly public certainty can turn against private lives. By evening, the Tower changed again. The stone held the days cold. The river kept moving beyond the walls, as if history were none of its concern. Somewhere within the complex, officers wrote reports. Somewhere else, prayers were whispered. Somewhere else, a prisoner measured time by sounds rather than clocks. And that is the image worth holding on to. Not a cartoon dungeon, but a system. A fortress in which architecture, monarchy, law, religion, and rumor were fused into one disciplined instrument. That is the real answer to what prison life was like inside the Tower of London in 1536. It was unequal, because rank still mattered. It was theatrical, because power wanted witnesses, even when the audience was small. It was psychological, because uncertainty was often more efficient than force. And it was modern in the most uncomfortable sense, because it showed how institutions do their best work when they can make punishment look procedural. So when you picture the tower now, do not picture only chains and screams. Picture clerks, warrants, confessions, inventories, river traffic, chapel bells, guards on routine, and prisoners trying to read the future from the sound of approaching feet. Picture a state discovering that the most effective prison is not simply the one with the strongest walls, but the one that persuades an entire country that resistance is hopeless. In the end, the Tower of London was never just a place where people were kept. It was a place where value was assigned and removed, where favor could become evidence, where law could be bent into ceremony, where a queen could sleep in rooms once prepared for her triumph and wake, knowing that the crown itself had turned into a weapon. That is why the Tower still grips the imagination, not because it was uniquely cruel by fantasy standards, but because it was so coldly rational by political ones. And that may be the darkest truth of all. The Tower did not simply imprison people. It taught England what centralized power looked like when it had stopped asking for consent and started demanding submission.